So I was thinking of making a video talking about the PS3 store closing down. There's plenty of other videos already out there talking about why it's a problem and everything. And then a little bit of time passed, and then we were reminded, of course, of what's going on with Nintendo and removing games digitally there. And I decided I just really wanted to make a video in general talking about the current state of digital games. Because honestly, I for one am not completely afraid of an all-digital future. I think there's a lot of potential really cool stuff that can come from digital as a distribution method. However, the way a lot of companies are handling it right now isn't the best example of what it could be, and honestly, what is best for the consumer. On the one hand, with Nintendo, we have the recent meme about Mario's death, where the Mario 35th anniversary has ended, and so a number of games have been delisted, though honestly, the even larger part of this conversation that I want to talk about in a bit is more to do with Fire Emblem. And on the other hand, with Sony, they are taking down the PS3, PSP, and PSVita stores, which are not only removing the ability to purchase and access some games that are purely available digitally on those platforms, but also some games that might be available in some other form, but not really in a way that's affordable at all. First off, let's talk about Nintendo real quick. As of the end of March, a number of games have been delisted from the Nintendo Switch eShop. The big one that people have focused on is, of course, Super Mario All-Stars, giving you an easy way to play 3 different 3D classic Mario games. There was a physical version of this made as well, however, that was also made in limited quantities, and so while that is something you might be able to try and track down in the future, its price is likely going to go up as time passes. But what's honestly, I think, an even bigger problem is Fire Emblem. This is a game that was originally never released in the US. We didn't get the first 6 games in the franchise localized in English. There was a remake on the DS that was released that did feature a number of changes, including some new plot beats, changing the gameplay, redone visuals, obviously. And so while the game is in a sense accessible through there, the actual original game, in an officially translated English capacity, was made available for the first time on the Switch digitally late last year, only to now be removed from the store. And so while Mario runs into the problem of asking people to track down what might become expensive physical copies of the game, or even track down the original versions of them individually on the N64, GameCube, and Wii, at least those options still exist. For Fire Emblem, the only officially released version in the West ever is now just gone. Now, as for Sony, the big discussion is, again, removing the PS3, PSP, and PS Vita store. Now, for a lot of people hearing this news for the first time, their first thought would probably be, well, why should I care? I own a PS4, I own a PS5, I've stopped using my PS3 ages ago, I already bought whatever games I care about, it's done, whatever. And I get that. But honestly, there's a lot that ends up being lost permanently as a result of this decision. Because PlayStation doesn't currently have any kind of good form of backwards compatibility for older systems behind the PS4, there's a number of titles that are permanently locked on the PS3 or their handhelds, many of which are also only available via digital, or at least in a way that is affordable for most people. And that's actually what I think for me hits the hardest, is those that are extremely expensive to not buy digitally. There's a lot of digital-only PS3, PS Vita titles that I absolutely agree are a major loss. But there are far more classic PS1 games that people have heard of all the time, many games that have critical acclaim and are told by many people and put on lists as being things you should absolutely check out and try if you get the chance, that were in some form accessible through this service, that are gone now. And this is actually one of my favorite things about the PS Vita, not using it to play Vita games, but using it as a portable way to play PS1 classics. For example, one of my favorite games on the PS1 is Suikoden 2. It's a cult classic RPG that doesn't always get talked about as much as, say, Final Fantasy, but it's an amazing game. It's also extremely expensive to buy a physical copy of. You can go and look on eBay right now. For a complete copy of that game physically, you're talking easy $300 as high as $400. And sure, you could buy just the discs alone, but it honestly doesn't get that much better. Meanwhile, compare that to its digital listing on the PS3, where it's $10. And this is not the only game that this is an example of. There are tons of classic PS1 games that are very expensive to pick up physically that are now no longer going to be more easily accessible once these stores get taken down. Now, it is worth clarifying that for the PS3 store situation, as well as the Nintendo stuff I already talked about, downloads are still safe. You can buy these games before the deadlines, and you can still install them afterwards. It's not like it's being completely removed. But again, this only helps out those who have taken the time to pay attention and buy these games, not necessarily people who are latecomers to either caring about a certain franchise or having access to a system like a Nintendo Switch. And look, when talking about all this, there's an important thing I want to clarify. I'm not against digital versions of games. I think the possibilities of an all-digital future are actually very exciting. However, all digital absolutely has its dangers, which a lot of people like to talk about, and are valid for talking about it because we are seeing those things happen right now. The truth of the matter is that if these digital options didn't exist in the first place, a lot of these games would, again, not be accessible for a lot of people. There are so many great games that if the only way to get them was to buy the original copy, most people would never be able to do that because they're not going to take the time to try and find a copy from a retailer, and guess what? Find one that's probably going to be at all an affordable price for someone that just wants to check it out and not necessarily pick it up for collector street cred. The fact of the matter is that digital as a form of content distribution has a lot more potential positives if it is handled correctly with the right care. And that's why situations like this are very important to remind people to talk about it. Having that conversation and bringing it up to these companies to let them know that, hey, look, this isn't really cool. If all the games we're talking about losing right now through the PlayStation 3 store were made available on PS5 or PS4 in some form, that would make the loss of the PS3 store considerably easy to swallow and honestly almost a non-issue because these games are still accessible. At the end of the day, I don't care if I can buy a new game for PS3. What I care about is that these games are made available in some form, and many of them are not anymore because of this decision. And of course, a popular response you're going to hear from a lot of people when talking about all these issues is, well, why not emulate? And honestly, yeah, why not? Normally, I don't really like talking about emulating games and modding stuff because I like supporting getting things through official channels when it is an option. But in this case, Sony and Nintendo are not really making these easy for people. The fact of the matter is that the piracy community is doing a better job of preserving these pieces of history than any major company is taking the time to care about. I understand from the business side of things why there's a very cynical approach to the concept of keeping these games supported. Jim Ryan is very popularly quoted for talking about the fact that he doesn't see why anyone would want to play PS1 or PS2 games, and for that matter, backwards compatibility is something that people oftentimes request but don't actually use. Which is fair, honestly. I think that is a true statement. But at the end of the day, this isn't about mass adoption. This is about preserving accessibility to classic games. There are certainly some franchises out there where new versions completely make older versions of the games not something people are really interested in playing anymore. But there are absolutely tons of games out there, especially single-player focused ones, where going back to play older games has merit. And look, some of this is just the result of ill planning. A lot of companies didn't necessarily go into a particular generation thinking that people would care about a game 20 years down the line, but that is where a major schism is occurring between the consumer and the business. Ultimately, Sony can continue focusing on just making brand new games for their brand new system and not care at all about history, and their bottom line's not really going to be affected. But again, that's why it's important that we have these conversations and people talk about it when they can. Because there's more at stake here than someone just suffering from FOMO because they didn't buy a game during its limited window. We are losing the ability to even access a number of these titles 5, 10, 15 years into the future. I'm not saying all this because I want to just focus on hate for these companies. That isn't what this is about. I mean, if you've watched my channel at all, you know I love Nintendo. I love Sony stuff too. I'm a big fan of a lot of their games and products, and that's why it's important to me that their older entries get preserved. Because if I have a fan ask me what some of my favorite games of all time are, and I want them to be able to have the chance to experience them for themselves, I don't want to tell them, guess what, you need to spend $400. I'd much rather tell them, oh yeah, it's $10 right over here, enjoy. I don't know, I know I'm ranting here a lot, but it's because this is honestly a really serious issue to me. I'm not just making this video because I thought, oh hey, topical news thing we can talk about. This is a serious thing. And while this isn't the only time something like this has happened, and there's going to be more instances of it occurring, this is just the next reminder of why we need to talk about it.